A chief executive worth more money than most small nations stood at the top of her marble steps and dared her own daughter to marry any man at the party. She meant it as a leash dressed up as a gift. She did not expect the girl to set down her champagne, cross the entire ballroom, walk out through the open French doors, and stop in front of the one man in the garden holding a paper cup of punch he had poured for the small girl beside him. His car was the first thing Diane Hartwell noticed about him. A 14-year-old Honda the color of old nickels, parked in a row of black SUVs and silver coupes like a stone in a tray of jewelry. The man who climbed out of it wore a gray suit that fit him but had been pressed too many times. He did not fold a tip into the valet's hand the way the other men did. He simply said thank you and meant it, and he turned toward the lights of the party as though he belonged inside them. Diane set her wine on the stone railing. She had stopped drinking it an hour ago. $400,000 had gone into this single evening. The orchestra, the garden lights strung through oaks that were older than her marriage, a guest list that read like the index of a business quarterly. All of it built around one quiet purpose, which was to find her daughter a husband worth the Hartwell name before the board meeting in November turned that name into a question instead of an answer. So she had dared Claire in front of 300 people. She had laughed when she said it. Marry anyone here, darling. Anyone at all. I will sign the company over the morning after the wedding. And now her daughter was standing in the grass in front of a stranger with a paper cup in his hand, and Diane could not breathe. If you have ever watched someone discover that the person they wrote off was the most important person in the room, drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to know where you are watching from tonight. Subscribe and ring the bell, because what Diane Hartwell learned over the next 90 days is not the story she thought she was telling, and you are going to want to be here when the truth about the man in the gray suit finally arrives. His name was Elijah Cross, and he had not wanted to come to the party at all. He came because his sister Renata had called him on Tuesday and told him she needed a +1 for the Hartwell fundraiser, that her husband was traveling, that she could not walk into that particular crowd alone, and that he owed her for the summer of 2019, a debt she invoked so rarely it could not be argued with. Renata catered events for people like the Hartwells. She had built her business one cold canapé tray at a time, and a Hartwell party was the kind of evening that put 3 new clients in her phone by midnight. She needed her brother in a suit, standing near the bar, looking like he belonged. He brought his daughter because the sitter canceled, and because Nadia did not like to be left, and because he had made a promise 4 years ago that he had organized his entire life around keeping. Nadia was 8. She had her mother's hands, long-fingered and quick, already too good at the piano for the patience Elijah could offer her, and she had her mother's habit of tilting her head exactly 9 degrees to the left when she was deciding whether an adult was lying to her. She did it to teachers. She did it to the pediatrician. She had done it once to a judge, and the judge laughed out loud in a courtroom where nothing else was funny. Her mother had been named Sophia. Sophia had been gone for 4 years, and Elijah still made 2 cups of coffee every morning out of a habit his hands would not surrender. He drank one. He poured the second one down the sink at 7:40 after the school drop-off in the quiet of a kitchen that had been built for 2 adults and now held 1 adult and a child who asked questions he could not always answer. He was a forensic accountant. He told people he did taxes because the word forensic invited a second question, and he had learned not to invite second questions. The truth was that Elijah Cross read money the way a tracker reads a forest floor. He could look at 12 years of a corporation's filings and tell you which quarter the lying started. He had testified in federal court 11 times. He had put 4 men in prison and recovered, across his career, a little more than $200 million that had been stolen from pension, funds, charities, and the kind of small investors who never recover from being robbed. He did this work quietly. He drove the Honda, but because the Honda was paid for. He packed Nadia's lunch every morning, the same lunch, turkey and provolone with the crust cut off one half and left on the other, because she was at the age of negotiating with her own preferences. He coached nothing and volunteered for nothing and attended every recital, every parent night, every small ceremony where 8-year-olds were handed certificates for things that did not matter and mattered enormously. What nobody at the Hartwell party knew, what Renata herself only half knew, was that Elijah had spent the last 7 months building a case. He could not tell anyone about it. He had signed documents that made silence a legal obligation. He came to the party as his sister's +1, and he stood near the bar, and he poured his daughter a cup of punch, and he watched a woman in a silver dress dare her daughter to marry a stranger, and he thought about how much he wanted to go home. He did not know that the company at the center of the case he had been building, the company whose filings he had been reading until 2 in the morning for 7 months, the company that had quietly moved $40 million through a charitable foundation that existed only on paper, was named Hartwell Capital. He did not know whose house he was standing in. Claire Hartwell knew exactly what she was doing. People had been telling Claire who to marry since she was 19. Her mother had a way of introducing men that made them sound like acquisitions, a portfolio of jawlines and trust funds, and Claire had spent a decade being polite to all of them. She was 31. She ran the foundation arm of her mother's company, the part that gave money away, and she had recently begun to notice that some of the money the foundation gave away came back through a side door she was not supposed to see. She had not told anyone what she noticed. She did not have the language for it. She knew how to read a room and how to read a balance sheet only well enough to know when one was wrong, and the foundation's numbers had started to feel wrong in the specific way that a stair feels wrong in the dark when there is one fewer step than your body expected. When her mother dared her, in front of 300 people, Claire understood the dare for what it was. A leash dressed as a gift. Marry the right man and inherit the company. The right man meaning the man Diane selected, meaning the arrangement would continue, meaning the side door would stay open and Claire would learn, eventually, to stop looking at it. So she set down her champagne, and she searched the garden for the one person who clearly did not want to be there. The one man who had not looked at her once, who was crouched down adjusting the collar of a small girl's cardigan with a tenderness that had nothing to do with being watched. She walked to him because walking to him was the only move on the board her mother had not anticipated. She did not know his name. She did not know his profession. She knew only that he was the single variable Diane Hartwell had not placed on the table. Herself, and somewhere on the long walk across the lawn, Claire had decided she was done playing a game where her mother owned all the pieces. Stop here for 1 second. Before Claire reaches him, before any of this becomes what it becomes, I need you to do something. If you believe the people who get underestimated are usually the ones holding the most, comment the name of your city below. Tap subscribe. Ring the bell. Because what Diane Hartwell does in the next 10 minutes is the worst decision of her life. And what Elijah Cross does in response is the reason this story is worth telling now. The lawn. Diane reached them before Claire could speak. She came down the marble steps faster than dignity allowed, crossed the grass in heels that punished her for every step, and arrived at her daughter's side with a smile arranged so carefully it could have been notarized. She put a hand on Claire's arm. She laughed the laugh she used for donors who gave less than they had promised. "Sweetheart," she said, "you misunderstood the game." Claire did not move. Diane turned to Elijah then, and she looked at him the way she had looked at the Honda, and Elijah watched her do it. He had been looked at this way before. He knew the inventory she was taking, the suit, the shoes, the absence of a watch, the child, the conclusion she was assembling out of all of it before he had said a single word. I am sure you are a lovely man, Diane said, but this is a private family matter, and I think it would be best if you and your daughter enjoyed the rest of the evening near the bar. Nadia tilted her head 9 degrees to the left. Elijah felt the small motion against his hand because Nadia had taken his hand, and he understood that his daughter had just decided something about the woman in the silver dress. He said nothing. He had spent his entire professional life learning when silence was the strongest position in the room, and he recognized the moment for what it was. He picked up the paper cup of punch he had set on the low garden wall, and he held it, and he waited. Diane mistook his silence for retreat. She had spent 30 years mistaking other people's restraint for weakness, and it had worked so reliably for so long that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She turned back to her daughter. She lowered her voice to the register she used for closing. Claire Shades. She said, "You have embarrassed yourself, and you have embarrassed me, and you have embarrassed this poor man who clearly just wants to go home. The company is not a toy. The dare was a joke. Now please." Claire looked at Elijah. "What is your name?" she asked. He told her Elijah. "And your daughter Nadia," he said. "We were just leaving." "You do not have to leave," Claire said. Diane laughed again, but the laugh had a crack in it now, a hairline thing, the first one. She reached for her phone. She had no reason to reach for it except that holding it returned a feeling of control to her hands, and her hands had begun to need it. "I am going to ask the staff to walk you out," Diane said. And she said it to Elijah, not to Claire, and the word staff did a great deal of work in that sentence, and everyone standing within 10 feet of the garden wall heard exactly what it was meant to do. That was the moment Renata arrived. She had been carrying a tray of empty glasses back toward the kitchen tent when she saw her brother, standing in a tightening circle of attention. And she crossed the lawn with the specific speed of a woman who has spent her life diffusing situations in rooms she was hired to be invisible in. She set the tray down on the garden wall. She looked at Diane. She looked at her brother. She did the math in half a second, and the math made her tired in a way that went back decades. Mrs. Hartwell Renata said, "This is my brother. He is my guest tonight." Diane's face performed a small recalculation. The caterer's brother. That was worse, somehow, in the private ledger Diane kept. She opened her mouth, and before she could speak, a man in a dark coat came across the lawn from the direction of the driveway, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never once in his adult life had to wonder whether he was allowed to be somewhere, and he was holding a phone, and he was looking at Elijah, and he said the sentence that ended the party. "Mr. Cross, I am sorry to interrupt. The deputy director needs you on the line. The bureau is moving on Hartwell Capital at 9 in the morning, and they need your sign off on the asset. Freeze tonight." The garden went very quiet. Diane Hartwell heard her own company's name come out of a stranger's mouth, attached to the word bureau, attached to the words asset freeze, and she felt the marble steps and the orchestra and the oaks and the $400,000 rearrange themselves around a new center of gravity, and the new center of gravity was the man in the pressed gray suit holding a paper cup of punch. To understand what that man in the dark coat was doing on Diane Hartwell's lawn, you have to go back 7 months to a federal building in the city, to a 4th-floor office with bad lighting and a window that looked out on a parking structure. His name was David Okafor, and he was a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Division. And he had been the one to bring Elijah the Hartwell file in October. They had worked together for 9 years. David found the cases. Elijah read the money. It was a partnership built on a single shared belief, which was that the people who steal the most are almost never caught doing anything that looks like stealing, that the real theft happens in the spaces between legal documents, in the footnotes, in the quarter where a number that should have gone up went sideways instead, and that catching it required a person who could sit with 12,000 pages and feel the one wrong thing, the way you feel a draft in a sealed room. The Hartwell case had started with a tip. A bookkeeper at a children's literacy nonprofit had noticed that a grant from the Hartwell Foundation arrived, was recorded, and then 90 days later, an almost identical sum left the nonprofit's account toward a consulting firm nobody there had ever hired. She reported it. The report went into a system. The system eventually put it on David Okafor's desk, and David walked it down the hall to the one man he trusted to tell him whether it was nothing or everything. It was everything. Elijah spent the first month just mapping the structure. The Hartwell Foundation gave money to 41 nonprofits. 19 of them were real, did real work, helped real people. 22 of them were also real, also did real work, and were also being used. Money flowed in as charity and flowed out as fees, and the fees went to 11 consulting firms, and the 11 consulting firms shared 4 mailing addresses. And the 4 mailing addresses trace back to a single holding company in Delaware. And the holding company was owned by a trust, and the trust had one beneficiary. It took him until February to prove the last link because the people who had built the structure were not stupid and the final connection had been buried under 3 layers of shell entities and a genuinely clever bit of accounting that, in another life, Elijah might have admired. He worked at night. He worked after Nadia was asleep, at the kitchen table, with the second cup of coffee he should not have poured going cold beside the laptop. He worked weekends when Nadia was at a friend's house. 7 months he carried the entire architecture of a $40 million fraud in his head, and he could not tell a single person, not Renata, not Nadia's teacher who asked why he looked so tired, not the other parents at the recital who made small talk about their jobs. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement with the federal government. The case was sealed. If the Hartwells learned they were under investigation before the asset freeze was in place, the money would move in a single night and never be seen again. Elijah understood this better than anyone, because Elijah was the one who would have to chase it, and he knew exactly how unrecoverable it would become. So when his sister asked him to stand near a bar in a suit at a fundraiser, he said yes, because he had no possible way of knowing whose fundraiser it was. The invitation said Hartwell Estate. It did not say Hartwell Capital. He had spent 7 months inside the company's filings and had never once had a reason to learn the home address of the woman whose trust sat at the bottom of the whole rotten structure. He walked onto Diane Hartwell's lawn, the way you might walk into a photograph of a place you have studied your whole life without recognizing it, because the document and the world are different things, and a balance sheet does not have oak trees. David had been trying to reach him for 2 hours. The freeze had moved up. A judge had signed the order early. The Bureau needed Elijah's certification on the forensic summary before 9 the next morning. And David, unable to reach him by phone, had done the thing 9 years of partnership entitled him to do. He had tracked the location of the event from Renata's public catering calendar, and he had driven out to the estate himself, and he had walked across the lawn at the exact moment that the woman at the center of his case was threatening to have his colleague removed by her staff. David Okafor was not a dramatic man. He had not planned the timing. He would say later, to Elijah, in the only conversation the two of them ever had about that night, that he had felt the whole lawn go strange as he approached, that he had registered the silver dress and the raised phone and the small girl holding Elijah's hand, and that he had simply said the thing he had driven out to say, because he did not yet understand that the woman he needed to walk past was the woman his sentence was about to destroy. He understood it about 1 second after he finished speaking. Diane Hartwell did not move. She stood on her own lawn, in her own silver dress, under the lights she had paid to hang in her own trees, and she looked at the man in the dark coat, and then she looked at the man in the gray suit, and the second look was different from every look she had given him before, because she was no longer taking inventory. She was reading a sentence she did not want to have read. She was beginning to understand what she had been standing next to. "The deputy director," she said. The words came out of her without her permission. David Okafor turned. He saw her fully for the first time. He saw the silver dress, and he placed it against the photographs in the case file. The woman at the charity gala, the woman cutting the ribbon at the new wing of the hospital, the woman whose signature sat at the bottom of 41 grant letters. And he closed his mouth, and he looked at Elijah, and something passed between the two men that did not need language. Elijah set the paper cup of punch down on the garden wall. He crouched slowly, and he zipped Nadia's cardigan the rest of the way up, because the evening had gotten cold, and because his hands needed something true to do. Then he stood, and he looked at Diane Hartwell, and he said the only thing he said to her the entire night: "You should call your attorney before you call your staff." He did not say it cruelly. He did not say it with any weight at all. He said it the way you would tell a stranger their headlights were on, a small courtesy extended to a person about to discover a much larger problem, and that was what made it unbearable. He took his daughter's hand. Renata picked up her tray of empty glasses, because Renata had been raised in the same house Elijah had by the same mother who taught them both that you finish the work in front of you, no matter what is happening around you, and the work in front of Renata was a tray of glasses that needed to go back to the kitchen. Claire Hartwell watched the man she had crossed an entire ballroom to walk back toward the valet stand with a child holding one hand, and she understood that she had, by pure accident, walked directly to the one person in the western half of the state who could not be bought, could not be impressed, and could not be folded into her mother's portfolio of jawlines, and she began, quietly, at the edge of the worst night of her family's life, to laugh. Not cruelly, not at her mother. She laughed the way a person laughs when a door they did not know was locked turns out to have been open the entire time. Nadia tugged her father's hand at the valet stand and asked if the lady in the shiny dress was in trouble. And Elijah said yes, a little. And Nadia thought about that while the man brought the Honda around. And then she said the lady had been rude. And Elijah said yes, she had. And Nadia nodded as though this confirmed a theory she had been developing all evening. And she got in the car, and she fell asleep before they reached the highway. Diane Hartwell drove herself home that night. She did not let her assistant drive her. She did not let the car service take her. She sent everyone away, and she walked through her own emptying party, past the orchestra, packing its instruments, and the catering staff folding the tables, and she got into her car, and she sat in the driver's seat in the garage for a long time without turning the key. She thought about the man's face. Not the moment of the reveal. Earlier, she thought about the way he had crouched to fix the child's collar in the middle of the worst thing Diane had ever tried to do to a stranger, and how the crouching had been the answer to a question she had not known she was asking, which was whether the man cared at all what she thought of him, and the answer had been so completely no that it rearranged something in her chest. She thought about the word staff and the way she had used it as a weapon, and how the weapon had been pointed, the entire time, at a man who had recovered $200 million for people. Exactly like the bookkeeper at the children's literacy nonprofit who had started all of this. She did not know that detail yet. She would learn it later, in a deposition where a federal investigator named David Okafor would describe Elijah Cross's career in a flat professional voice that was somehow worse than any speech. But sitting in the garage that night, she knew enough. She knew she had looked at a man and a child and a 14-year-old Honda and assembled a person out of those parts, and that the person she had assembled did not exist, and that the actual man had been holding her entire life in a sealed federal file for 7 months, while she decided he belonged near the bar. She thought about Claire, walking across the lawn. She thought about the fact that her daughter had seen something in 3 seconds that Diane had failed to see in an entire evening, and that this was not an accident, that Claire had been seeing things lately Diane had trained herself not to see, the side door, the consulting fees, the grants that came back, and that her daughter's instinct to walk toward the one honest man in the garden was not rebellion but recognition. Diane Hartwell did not cry in the car. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not give herself the relief of it now. She sat in the dark and understood, for the first time and only partially, that the story she had told herself about who she was, the philanthropist, the builder, the woman who had made something from nothing, was a story that was about to be read back to her by strangers in a language she did not control, and that some of it was going to be true. She went inside. She did not sleep. The morning after the party, Elijah Cross made 2 cups of coffee. He drank one. He poured the second one down the sink at 7:40 after he dropped Nadia at school, and the kitchen was quiet, and the case that had lived in his head for 7 months was no longer only his to carry, because at 9 in the morning the Bureau moved on Hartwell Capital, and the thing became real in the world, with agents and warrants, and a freeze order, and Elijah's part in it shifted from the long private labor of building to the long public labor of proving. He certified the forensic summary. He spent the next 3 days in the federal building with David Okafor, walking attorneys through the structure he had spent 7 months mapping, and the attorneys, who were good at their jobs and had seen a great deal, went quiet in the specific way that meant the work was airtight. David teased him about the party on the second day. They were eating sandwiches in the bad lighting office, and David said that in 9 years he had never once made an entrance, and that he had now made the entrance of his entire career completely by accident, walking onto a rich woman's lawn to ruin her party without knowing it was her party, and that nobody would ever believe it had not been staged. Elijah said that Nadia had asked if the lady in the shiny dress was in trouble. David asked what he had told her. "A little," Elijah said. "I told her a little." David laughed, and then he stopped laughing, and he said the thing 9 years of partnership had earned him the right to say, which was that Elijah looked lighter than he had looked in 7 months, and that it was good to see, and that he should take the kids somewhere over the weekend and not think about Delaware holding companies for 48 hours. Elijah said he would think about it. He did not, in the end, take Nadia anywhere dramatic. On Saturday, they went to the pancake place they always went to, the one with the laminated menus, and the waitress who called Nadia Professor because Nadia had once corrected her on the definition of a crepe, and Nadia ordered the same thing she always ordered, and Elijah drank coffee he had not made himself, and at one point Nadia looked up from her plate and asked him the question. She asked if the lady in the shiny dress had been mean to him because of his car. Elijah set his cup down carefully. He could have said no. He could have given her the version that protects a child from the architecture of the world, the version where people are unkind for no reason, and the reasons do not have names. He had given her that version before, about other things, and he would give it to her again, because there are ages at which the truth is a weight a child should not have to carry. But Nadia had tilted her head 9 degrees to the left, the way Sophia used to, and Elijah had promised himself in a hospital 4 years ago that he would not lie to this child any more than he absolutely had to. So he told her a smaller, truer thing. He said that sometimes people decide who you are before they know you, and they use things like cars and clothes to decide it, and that they are almost always wrong, and that the kindest thing and the hardest thing is to let them be wrong and keep being yourself until they figure it out. Nadia thought about this. She asked if the lady had figured it out. Elijah said he thought she was starting to. Nadia nodded, and she returned to her pancakes, and she said, around a mouthful she should not have been talking around, that their car was a good car because it always started. And Elijah agreed that this was the most important quality a car could have, and that was the end of the conversation. And it was also, though Nadia would not understand this for many years, the most important thing he ever taught her. A week later, a letter came to the federal building, forwarded to Elijah through David. It was a commendation from the deputy director, the formal kind, the kind that goes in a file. It used Elijah's full name, and it used the words exceptional and integrity, and it noted that the recovery in the Hartwell matter was likely to exceed $38 million returned to the defrauded nonprofits and their beneficiaries. Elijah read it once. He did not show it to anyone. He put it in the drawer in the kitchen, where he kept the things that mattered and did not need to be seen. Nadia's hospital bracelet from the day she was born, Sophia's library card, the program from a recital, and he closed the drawer. And he started dinner. Because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesday was the night they made the pasta with too much cheese. Diane Hartwell came to his door in the second week of November. She came alone. She did not bring an attorney, which her actual attorney had advised against in the strongest possible terms, and she did not bring the car service, and she stood on the step of the small house with the paid-off Honda in the driveway, and she held a glass dish covered in foil. Elijah opened the door. He did not say anything. He had known in an abstract way that this might happen because he understood people the way he understood money. And he had read in the few public statements her lawyers had released the particular shape of a person beginning to understand the size of what they had done. "I made too much," Diane said. She held out the dish. It was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie. Nobody makes too much of a thing and drives it 40 minutes across the city to the home of a man whose family fortune they are currently losing in federal court. The dish was an apology that could not be spoken, because the speaking of it would have required Diane to assemble words for a thing she did not yet fully understand, and she was honest enough, now, finally, not to perform an understanding she had not earned. Elijah looked at the dish. Then he took it, because refusing it would have been its own kind of cruelty, and Elijah had never in his life been cruel to a person who was trying, however badly, to become better than they had been. He said she did not have to do that. She said she knew, and that was nearly all of it, except that Nadia appeared in the hallway behind her father, in her pajamas, holding the book she was supposed to be reading for school, and she looked at the lady who was no longer wearing a shiny dress, who was wearing a regular coat and regular shoes, and looked smaller than she had, looked on the lawn, and Nadia tilted her head 9 degrees to the left. "You were rude to my dad," Nadia said. Diane Hartwell looked at the child. "I was," she said. Nadia considered this with the full gravity of an 8-year-old receiving an apology that had been correctly addressed. "Okay," Nadia said. And that was all. Okay. Not it is fine, because Nadia had been raised by a man who never once told her that unkind things were fine. Just okay. The acknowledgement that the rude thing had been named by the person who did it, which was, in the moral universe of an 8-year-old, the entire transaction. She went back to her room to read her book. Diane stood on the step a moment longer. She looked at Elijah, and there was something she wanted to say, and she did not have it yet. And to her enormous credit, she did not reach for a substitute. She did not fill the silence with the easy thing. She let it be incomplete because it was incomplete, and she had spent her whole life smoothing incomplete things into finished ones and calling it grace. And she was done doing that, or she was beginning to be done, which was all anyone could honestly claim. "Thank you for the food," Elijah said. She nodded. She walked back to her car. She drove home. The case took 2 years to resolve. Diane Hartwell did not go to prison, in the end, though 2 of the people who had built the structure for her did, and she lost the company, and she lost most of the money, and she spent 18 months in the particular public daylight that falls on people whose names had only ever appeared in the society pages, and now appeared in different ones. Claire ran the foundation through the receivership, the real part of it, the 19 nonprofits that had always been real, and she did it well, and she did it without her mother, and the 2 of them began, slowly, in the way of families who have survived a fire together, to build a different kind of conversation out of the ash. Elijah Cross went back to work. There were always more cases. David always found them, and Elijah always read them, and the money was always hidden in the same kinds of places, in the footnotes, in the quarter where the number went sideways. On a Sunday the following spring, Elijah finished a small task he had been meaning to do for a long time. He took the commendation out of the kitchen drawer, the one from the deputy director, and he did not frame it, because framing it would have meant putting it on a wall where it would be looked at, and that was not what the letter was for. Instead, he took down the recital program from the shelf above the piano, the one from Nadia's first performance, the one where she had played a piece with both hands for the first time and missed 3 notes and finished, anyway with her chin up exactly the way her mother used to lift hers, and he put that in a frame, and he hung it on the wall in the hallway. The commendation went back in the drawer. Nadia found the framed program on her way to bed and asked why he had hung up the one where she made mistakes instead of one of the later ones where she played it clean. Because that is the one where you did not stop, Elijah said. Nadia looked at it for a moment, head tilted 9 degrees to the left, deciding whether this was the truth. She decided it was. She went to brush her teeth. Elijah stood in the hallway of the small house with a paid-off car in the driveway, and he turned off the light in the kitchen. And he checked that the door was locked. And he poured water into the coffee maker for the morning, 2 cups, because his hands still would not surrender the habit, and he had stopped asking them to. He looked in on Nadia, who was already asleep, the book she was supposed to be reading open on her chest. He took the book and marked her page and set it on the nightstand, and he turned off the lamp. And he stood for a moment in the doorway of his daughter's room in the dark, a man who had been underestimated by a woman in a silver dress, and who had not, even once, felt the need to correct her, because he had learned a long time ago that the work tells the truth eventually, that you do not have to, that you only have to keep doing it. He pulled the door until it was almost closed. He left it open the width of his hand, the way she liked it, the way she had liked it since she was 4, so that the light from the hallway could find its way in, and then he went to make sure the morning was ready, and the house was quiet, and somewhere across the city a woman in a regular coat was learning, slowly, the thing the child had known in 3 seconds on the lawn.